Okay, I'm making this video for all you manual transmission fans, and especially Tremec TKO fans. Let me show you what happened here. A customer brought me a Tremec, said it blew up, so I took it apart to see what was wrong with it. I needed 14 different parts to fix it. I'll explain what happened. First of all, here's the input shaft. The input bearing is still intact, but it's black from heat. Got so hot it turned black. Here's the race. If you look on the inside, it's black and blue from heat. How this bearing didn't explode, I will never know. Here's the input shaft. The gears have completely melted away. They did not break off, they melted off. If they broke off, you'd have jagged broken teeth right here. You don't have any. And there were no broken teeth inside the transmission case. They've completely melted down to nothing. Here's the counter gear, counter shaft. This gear mates up with this gear. This one has melted down to almost nothing. It is smooth. If you look at it from the front, you can see the teeth are almost gone. They have melted down to almost nothing. The bearing on the front, this is what's left of it. This is the race that goes in the front of the case. You can see the inside of the bearing cage is destroyed and has welded itself into the race. Now, in case you didn't see, on the front of the counter gear, there's what's left of the roller bearings. They have actually welded themselves onto the shaft. These roller bearings, and they might come off if I hit them with a hammer and chisel, but they're on there pretty damn good. They won't come off by hand. These roller bearings are welded on there to the shaft. This fourth gear clutch cone, which goes right here behind the input shaft, it was welded from heat right onto the shaft. I had to break it loose with a hammer and chisel to get this off. Right behind the fourth gear clutch cone, you have two races. They're called thrust washers. And then sandwiched in between these, you have a round thrust bearing. These washers are severely damaged and almost completely eaten away. And the bearings that goes in between here, here's what's left of them. I found these little tiny roller bearings down in the bottom of the transmission case. In fact, this is the only thing that was in the bottom of the transmission case with these little roller bearings. Like I said, all the teeth from the input shaft, they just melted away. They were not in the transmission case. This is the steel cup that goes in the front of the transmission case, and it was not that severely damaged, but I replaced it anyway. And this race fits into this, and then that goes on to the front of the counter shaft like that. But anyway, the input shaft completely wasted. Gears melted right off. Bearing still intact, but so black from heat that I replaced that. Counter shaft, I got roller bearings welded onto the front of it. The teeth almost completely melted down to nothing. Thrust bearing, thrust washers completely shot. This is damaged, so I replaced that. Also, there's 17 bearings that go into the rear of the input shaft. They were damaged, so I replaced those too. Alright, now, how did this happen? No oil in the case. When I opened the case up, there was about maybe 1 or 2 ounces of oil down in the bottom. So this is what happens when you're going down the interstate with no oil in the transmission. Now, why was the guy driving with no oil? What happened to the oil? Well, I'll tell you what happened to it. There is a air vent on the top of these Tremix. All manual transmissions have an air vent somewhere in the top. Without the air vent, the inside of the transmission will get hot, build up pressure, and the oil will be forced out through the rear seal while you're driving. Now, unfortunately, this gentleman that owns this transmission, he's got an old Tremec 3550. He's had it for about 22 years, he said. The air vent is in the shifter. It's in the stock factory shifter. A couple years ago, the shifter was worn out and sloppy, so he decided to change it with a brand new Hurst shifter. So 2 years ago, he put a brand new Hurst shifter on the transmission, and he said it was just night and day in the way it shifted. The throws were shorter and tighter and much better than the stock shifter. But the Hurst does not have an air vent in it. And he didn't really notice that when he was swapping the shifter out, he didn't really pay attention to it. He didn't really notice or pay attention that the Hurst did not have an air vent. He swapped it out without really paying that any mind. So for 2 years he drove around on the street with no air vent, slowly having all of his oil pushed out of the rear seal. Of course, he didn't know this was happening, but it took 2 years. After 2 years, he's finally had no oil in the transmission. He's going down the interstate 70 miles an hour, and kaboom! Gears melted off, bearings locked up and exploded. He didn't know what the hell had happened. But this is it. So keep in mind, if you ever change an old stock shifter that has an air vent in it, and you're swapping it out with an aftermarket shifter that does not have an air vent, but this is what's going to happen. It'll take a while, but all the oil is going to be forced out of the rear seal, and you're going to be going along with no oil. And it was $800 for these parts, just for the parts. $800. The counter shaft was $350. The input shaft was, I think it was $150. This bearing is $80. This bearing here for the front counter shaft, that was $70. So this stuff is not cheap. $800 because he swapped out the stock shifter with a Hurst shifter. And so that's just a lesson to be learned. Hope everybody learns something from this, and so that it never happens to them.